Chapter 7 closed with a loop: the promise, the evidence, and the action. That loop is the structural backbone of governance by assurance. But structure alone does not make the loop turn. Something else determines whether an organization actually uses its QOQM trees, whether signals get raised or suppressed, whether uncomfortable data reaches the people who need to act on it. That something is culture. And Chapter 8 makes the case that culture is not the soft layer sitting underneath the real governance work. It is itself a capability, arguably the most important one, and it functions as a control surface through which every other capability either operates as designed or quietly degrades. Two organizations can share the same frameworks, the same policies, and similar technical architectures, and produce dramatically different results when things go wrong. The difference is almost never in the documentation. It is in the living system, the patterns of behavior, the unwritten rules about what gets said in which rooms, and what happens to people who surface bad news. This chapter is about diagnosing that gap and understanding what leaders can actually do about it. The image on this slide captures what Chapter 8 is fundamentally about. A single signal travels through a system. At one point it hits a junction, fans out through a complex web of pathways, and what emerges on the other side depends entirely on how that web is wired. Culture is that web. It is the hidden interface between the formal system, the policies, the architecture, the review processes, and the living system, which is what people actually do when they are under pressure, when the schedule is slipping, when the metrics look bad, and when saying something uncomfortable might cost them something. Most governance conversations focus on the formal system because that is what can be documented and audited. But formal systems do not make decisions. People do. And the patterns governing how people decide what to say, what to flag, and what to let slide constitute a control surface as real and consequential as any technical architecture. The subtitle on this slide, Diagnosing the Formal System versus the Living System in Digital Value Management, names exactly what this chapter sets out to do. 2 post-incident reviews. Same frameworks, same policies, similar architectures. But look at the difference in what happened in each room. On the left, the outcome is captured in a single sentence: we had the data, but it never made it into the room where the decision was made. The signal existed. The analysis existed. The circuit broke somewhere between the person who had the information and the person who needed it. On the right, the description reads differently: we laid out everything we knew, nobody was penalized, and we left with 3 clear experiments. The signal traveled. The loop closed. The organization came out of the review knowing something it did not know going in. The subheading on this slide names the core claim of the chapter directly. Culture is not background noise. It is the defining variable that determines which system you actually operate. Technical capability, framework compliance, and architectural investment all matter. But when a pressure moment arrives, and they always do, what actually determines the outcome is whether the people in the room feel safe enough to say what they know. The valve metaphor in this diagram earns its place because it is precise. System evidence flows in on the left. Operational decisions flow out on the right. Between them sits culture, acting as the interface that either opens the flow or throttles it. 3 labels surround the valve, and each one is doing specific work. The first says culture is not a mood, not a survey score, not a motivational poster, not the general atmosphere in the office. It is a set of specific, repeatable behaviors. That distinction matters because behaviors can be observed, named, and changed, while moods are notoriously difficult to act on. The second label names culture as a valve, the interface that determines whether uncomfortable realities are surfaced or suppressed. That is an operational definition, not a psychological one. And the third label names it as a capability in its own right, the control surface through which every other technical capability either functions or quietly fails. The implication is significant. An organization can invest heavily in detection, planning, and assurance capabilities, and still find that those investments produce little value if the cultural valve is closed. The evidence exists but never reaches the decision. The signal fires but nobody acts on it. Treating culture as a capability means treating it with the same diagnostic rigor applied to any other part of the system. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster is one of the most analyzed organizational failures in modern history, And the reason it keeps appearing in governance discussions is that the process did not fail. That point deserves emphasis. The formal review steps were followed, and the technical risk was fully understood by the engineers who raised it. O-ring performance data in cold temperatures had been identified as a concern. That data went into the launch decision process, and then the cultural fault tree took over. Schedule pressure outweighed evidence. Management required proof of failure rather than proof of risk, a subtle but devastating inversion of how a risk-aware organization should reason. Engineers who had standing in the technical domain did not have standing in the decision-making domain. The signal was present. The control surface was closed. The digital parallel named on this slide is not an abstraction. Assurance does not fail because data is absent. It fails because the culture does not make it safe to act on what the data says. Every organization that has experienced a preventable failure, while sitting on relevant internal evidence, is operating a version of the same fault tree. The geometry changes. The mechanism does not. Consider a specific moment that plays out in organizations every day. A metric fluctuates below its threshold. Not a crisis, not a confirmed failure, just a signal that something may be drifting. The DVMS overlay is in place. The outcome measure pair exists. What happens next is entirely a cultural question. The diagram traces two paths from that moment. On the upper path, someone raises a concern. The conversation gets messier. Questions get asked that do not have clean answers. The result, if the culture supports it, is a resilient boundary, a system that has actually exercised its ability to surface and address early signals. On the lower path, the response is to wait and see. The dashboards stay clean. The conversations stay comfortable. The result is a brittle system that has practiced suppression rather than inquiry. The question printed between those two paths captures the decision point with precision. Are people thanked for catching something early, or labeled as not being pragmatic? And at the other fork, does the post-incident review produce a sanitized summary that protects individuals at the expense of learning? Those are not rhetorical questions. They have observable answers in every organization, and the answers accumulate over time into the culture that determines which path becomes the default. Cultural distortion does not announce itself. It works through the ordinary mechanics of each capability, bending the output just enough that the system appears to be functioning while the signal degrades. In the govern capability, the distortion is penalizing bad news. The output looks like governance, there are policies, there are principles, there are commitments on paper. But those commitments are aspirational rather than operational, because the culture has learned that raising the things that threaten them is costly. In the assure capability, the distortion is fear of red metrics. When teams know that a red metric triggers scrutiny rather than inquiry, attention shifts to improving the number rather than improving the boundary. Sampling looks tidy while the underlying system remains fragile. In plan and design, the distortion is equating doubt with disloyalty. Architectural discussions become presentations. Risks are mentioned and moved past, rather than examined. The team leaves having performed alignment rather than achieved it. The synthesis note at the bottom of this slide names what all three distortions produce together. A plan that proceeds on the assumption that everything will go as specified, built on curated evidence. That is not a plan. It is a performance of planning. The distortions in the execution-facing capabilities tend to be sharper, because the stakes are more immediate and the time pressure is real. In the change capability, the distortion is avoiding concerns to prevent delaying a release. This is one of the most common cultural dynamics in technology organizations. The social cost of raising an issue at the wrong moment is high enough that the issue goes unraised. The capability functions on paper, there is a change process, there are approvals, but in practice it fails at the boundary where someone decides not to say the thing they noticed. In the execute capability, sometimes called the 2 in the morning node, the distortion is the social cost of escalation. If the norm in an organization is that waking people up is a bigger problem than tolerating slow degradation, on-call engineers will tolerate degradation. That norm does not appear in any policy document. It is transmitted through what happens the last time someone escalated. In innovate, the distortion is treating failure as a performance event. When failure triggers blame rather than learning, organizations run only safe experiments. They change what they deliver but never how they work. As the banner on this slide puts it, the mechanics of DVMS describe how work should move. Culture determines how much of that movement survives contact with reality. A key outcome metric drifts at the settlement boundary. Same metric, same DVMS overlay, two different organizations. What the review room does with that signal reveals more about the actual governance system than any document audit could. In what the slide calls the room of silence, the immediate reaction is defensive. Screens are studied, excuses are offered. The drift is labeled a one-time event. The implicit core question, how do we explain this away, is never stated aloud, but it governs the conversation. The metric gets recorded and the conversation moves on. Nothing changes at the boundary. In the room of curiosity, the immediate reaction is different. People actively question the mental model rather than defending it. The core question is explicit. What surprised us here and where did our model fail? The outcome is a specific change. A revised runbook, a follow-up drill, an updated metric. Something at the boundary is actually different after the review than it was before. The observation at the bottom of this slide is worth sitting with. More can be learned from 20 minutes in the room of curiosity than from 20 hours of technical documentation. That is not a comment on documentation quality. It is a comment on what kind of learning actually improves a system. Diagnosing a closed cultural valve requires knowing what to look for. 3 warning signals are reliable enough to treat as indicators that the assurance loop is broken, regardless of what the formal records show. The first is the absence of near misses. Every complex operational environment generates small failures, close calls, and anomalies that do not quite reach the threshold of a formal incident. If formal records only capture significant incidents, those smaller signals are being suppressed somewhere between the person who noticed them and the system that should have recorded them. That gap is precisely where systemic failures accumulate before they become undeniable. The second warning signal is divergent realities. Formal retrospectives and assurance reviews are consistently positive, while informal practitioner conversations are consistently worried. When those two channels carry different content, the formal channel is capturing the curated version. The third is defensive defaults in post-incident language, phrases like "who signed off on this" dominating the review conversation. That pattern trains people to protect themselves rather than inform the system, and once that training takes hold, it is self-reinforcing. None of these signals requires a culture survey to detect. They are observable in how meetings run, how incidents are documented, and what people say when they think they are not being evaluated. The distinction that runs through this entire chapter resolves into 2 columns. The paper system is formal. Clean dashboards, aspirational policies, curated evidence, tidy assurance sampling, defensive documentation. The result is a brittle system, one that executes cleanly on good days and scrambles on bad ones, because the signals that would have revealed fragility were smoothed away before they could prompt action. The living system looks different. Conversations are messier. Commitments are operational rather than aspirational. Uncomfortable realities get surfaced rather than softened. Inquiry dominates over blame. Learning accumulates across events rather than being contained within them. The result is a resilient system, one that is capable of discovery, not just execution. What makes this comparison practically useful is recognizing that most organizations are running both systems simultaneously. The paper system is what gets documented and reviewed. The living system is what actually determines behavior under pressure. The governance question is not which system is better, that is obvious. The question is which one the organization is actively cultivating, and whether the signals moving through the formal structure reflect the living system or conceal it. Culture changes, but not primarily through formal programs. The chart on this slide makes the mechanism visible. Over successive pressure moments, incidents, drifts, close calls, 2 trajectories diverge. One builds system resilience. The other degrades it. The difference is how leadership responds at each pressure moment. The degrading interface is triggered by familiar responses. demanding stricter approvals, asking who made this mistake, asking how this got through. Each of those responses adds friction and sends a signal that the reward for surfacing problems is more scrutiny and more paperwork. Over time, people stop surfacing problems. The interface degrades. The strengthening interface is triggered by a different set of responses, asking what decisions or conditions produced this, asking what about the system made this the easiest path, and critically, thanking the team for surfacing the pattern early. Those responses model a different norm. They tell people that bringing uncomfortable signals forward is valued rather than penalized. The interface strengthens. The key insight at the bottom of the slide is the practical conclusion. Culture changes through small, consistent signals of what the organization values under pressure, far more reliably than through formal culture programs. A value statement on a wall does not change behavior. The response to the last uncomfortable signal does. The DVMS architecture connects views, requires capabilities, and translates leadership questions into QOQM evidence. Architecturally, it is coherent, but architecture describes how things should connect. Culture determines whether they actually do. Two conditions, if present, undermine the architecture regardless of its elegance. The first, if the culture cannot tolerate honest discussions of weaknesses, QOQM trees get built on curated evidence. The outcomes declared are the outcomes people are comfortable declaring publicly, not necessarily the ones that reflect real operational risk. The second, if raising a concern at a boundary costs more than it gains, the assurance loop closes only on paper. The evidence appears to flow. The cycle appears to complete. But no one at the boundary is actually updating behavior based on what the metrics show. When both conditions are present, something important happens. The living system routes around the formal architecture. People develop workarounds, informal channels, and unstated agreements about what gets said in which rooms. The DVMS overlay's elegance becomes irrelevant because the real decisions are being made through a parallel system that the formal structure cannot see. Preventing that outcome is not an architectural problem. It is a cultural one. Culture, in the end, is the hidden interface between the humans who run the system and the system itself. That definition from this slide is precise enough to be operational. It is not about values or morale or engagement scores. It is about what actually passes through the interface when the system is under stress. Every time an uncomfortable signal is met with inquiry, the interface strengthens. Every time it is met with blame, the interface degrades. That pattern accumulates, boundary by boundary, incident by incident. No single response is decisive. The trajectory emerges from the aggregate of small moments, most of which seem inconsequential at the time. The closing line on this slide draws the distinction that Chapter 8 has been building toward. The mechanics of DVMS can be taught. The capacity to act honestly under pressure must be practiced. Teaching produces knowledge of what the system is supposed to do. Practice over real pressure moments builds the interface that determines what the system actually does. In the next chapter, we will move from the cultural conditions that make the system work to the strategic conversations that governance must be able to hold, connecting boundary-level assurance to the decisions that shape the organization's future.